For nearly 50 years, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance has been one of America's most gripping mysteries, a swirling mix of mob ties, political power, and countless dead-end leads. Books, documentaries, and even Hollywood took stabs at solving the riddle, but the truth always seemed just out of reach. That is, until now. In a shocking twist that's sending shockwaves through both law enforcement and the public, scientists may have finally cracked the case. What they discovered wasn't just buried in dirt, it was buried in decades of secrets, silence, and speculation. If you've ever been fascinated by unsolved crimes, mob lore, or the strange places history hides its skeletons, this story is about to pull you in. Because after all these years, the truth about Jimmy Hoffa may finally be coming to light. The man who vanished without a trace. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance is one of the most famous mysteries in American history, and it's been puzzling people for almost 50 years. The story is part crime thriller, part urban legend, and part unsolved puzzle that just won't quit. If you're into mysteries with a mix of mafia intrigue, labor union drama, and a dash of pure American folklore, Hoffa's Vanishing Act is right up your alley. So here's the deal. Jimmy Hoffa was this powerful and controversial labor union boss, the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. He had serious muscle in the labor world, but he was also tied, fairly or not, to organized crime. This mix of power, money, and mafia connections made him a target for both the law and rival criminals. Fast forward to July 30th, 1975, Hoffa was scheduled to meet with two guys connected to the mob, Tony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone, at a restaurant called the Machu's Red Fox in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, near Detroit. The plan? Apparently, to talk about Hoffa's efforts to regain control of the Teamsters Union after being out of the game for several years due to legal troubles. But here's where things get weird. Neither Provenzano nor Giacalone showed up. Hoffa called his wife to say the meeting was a no-show, and he'd be home by 4 p.m. That was the last anyone heard from him. After that, he just vanished. The next day, Hoffa's car was found abandoned in the restaurant's parking lot, but there was no sign of him. Witnesses reported seeing Hoffa get into a maroon Lincoln or Mercury with 3 other men, but after that, the trail goes cold. What happened next is pure speculation, mixed with some solid investigative efforts. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies launched massive searches, digging up backyards, construction sites, and even landfills. One thing many experts agree on is that Hoffa's disappearance was connected to organized crime and that he was likely killed because he was trying to reclaim his power in the Teamsters, threatening the interests of mob-linked rivals. Over the decades, countless tips and theories have popped up, some more believable than others. Recently, a team of independent investigators, the Case Breakers, claimed they had a lead pointing to a baseball stadium in Milwaukee. Meanwhile, the FBI has revisited tips about landfills in New Jersey and Michigan, keeping the mystery alive. The union boss who became America's greatest mystery, Jimmy Hoffa, was one of the most famous and controversial figures in American labor history. If you've ever heard the name but weren't sure why people are still talking about him decades after he vanished, here's the scoop. Hoffa was best known for being the powerful president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, a massive labor union representing truck drivers and other workers across the U.S. Back in the mid-20th century, the Teamsters weren't just any union, they were the union. And Hoffa, with his sharp wit, bulldog determination, and street smarts, made them a force to be reckoned with. What made Hoffa stand out wasn't just that he was a union leader, it was how he fought for workers. He came up from the working class himself, starting in Detroit and organizing warehouse workers in his teens. He didn't go to college, didn't come from privilege, and never backed down from a fight. Whether it was demanding better wages, safer working conditions, or pension benefits, Hoffa made sure the Teamsters had clout, real clout. Under his leadership, the union grew into one of the most powerful labor organizations in the country. But Hoffa wasn't just famous for helping workers. He also got a ton of attention for how he got things done. His connections to organized crime were one of the worst-kept secrets in America. While Hoffa always denied any wrongdoing, federal investigators and journalists linked him to several mafia figures. His control over the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, basically a massive pot of money used to fund retirement for truckers, became a major point of interest. That fund, many believed, was used to give out loans to mob-connected businesses, including casinos in Las Vegas. In the 1960s, things really started to catch up with him. The government, led by then Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, aggressively went after Hoffa, making him public enemy number one in the war on labor corruption. Hoffa ended up being convicted of jury tampering, mail fraud, and other charges in 1967. He went to prison, but not for long. President Richard Nixon commuted his sentence in 1971 under the condition that Hoffa would stay out of union business until 1980. Hoffa, of course, didn't like that and started working to regain control of the Teamsters. And then boom, he vanished. On July 30th, 1975, Hoffa was supposed to meet with two mob-connected men in suburban Detroit. He showed up. They didn't. He was never seen again. That's when Hoffa's fame went from big-name labor leader to full-on American legend. Everyone from the FBI to amateur sleuths has searched for his body. How a working-class kid became a fighter. Jimmy Hoffa's story begins in a small town called Brazil, Indiana, in 1913. His full name was James Riddle Hoffa. When Jimmy was still a young boy, tragedy hit the family hard. His father passed away unexpectedly when Jimmy was just a kid. Imagine how tough that must have been. Losing a parent early shapes a kid's life in ways that are hard to forget. After his dad's death, Jimmy's mom decided to move the family to Detroit, Michigan, a city that would become the backdrop for much of Hoffa's life and later his legendary career. Growing up in Detroit shaped young Hoffa in a big way. He didn't have much in terms of money or privilege, but he had grit and determination, and that would serve him well. By the time he was a teenager, Hoffa was ready to start working. He landed his first job in a grocery warehouse, unloading and moving stock. Hard labor, but a start. This was the early 1930s, smack in the middle of the Great Depression, when millions of Americans were struggling just to get by. The Great Depression was brutal, and Detroit was hit hard. Jobs were scarce, and the ones that existed often paid barely enough to keep families fed. For Hoffa, this was a crash course in what working-class life really meant. He saw firsthand the challenges workers faced: low wages, unsafe workplaces, and bosses who didn't always treat their employees fairly. These experiences planted the seeds of something bigger in him, a burning desire to fight for better conditions and fair treatment for workers. It wasn't just about the paycheck for Hoffa, it was about dignity and respect. And he wasn't the only one feeling that way. During those years, labor unions began to grow in importance. Unions were groups of workers banding together to demand fair wages, safer working conditions, and better hours. It was a way for everyday people to have a voice against powerful companies and harsh bosses. Hoffa's first exposure to labor organizing came during this tough time. The grocery warehouse where he worked was the kind of place where workers started talking about standing up for themselves. Strikes and protests weren't unusual. They were becoming a necessary tool in the fight for fair treatment. Hoffa watched these movements closely, learning the ropes of union activism and leadership. How Hoffa took over the Teamsters. Jimmy Hoffa officially joined the International Brotherhood of Teamsters during the 1930s. The Teamsters represented truck drivers and other transportation workers at a time when the trucking industry was booming, but so was worker exploitation. Hoffa quickly saw that many workers were getting the short end of the stick, and he wasn't about to stand for it. Photos of the brutal beating made headlines nationwide, shining a spotlight on the violent opposition unions faced and gaining public sympathy for labor leaders. Although Hoffa wasn't beaten that day, he watched closely. The message was clear: union work was risky, but the cause was too important to quit. Hoffa only doubled down. As time passed, Hoffa's wins kept piling up. He helped bring thousands of workers into the Teamsters and worked tirelessly to expand the union's reach. His success didn't go unnoticed. In 1952, Hoffa was elected vice president of the Teamsters, a major step toward the top. It wasn't just a title. He helped shape union policies and strategies during a time of rapid growth. But Hoffa wasn't satisfied with just being second in command. In 1957, He achieved his goal and was elected president of the Teamsters, taking charge of one of the country's most powerful labor unions. With over 1 million members, he became the union's public face. With that power, Hawa negotiated stronger contracts, expanded pension programs, and fought to get his members what they deserved. But with great power came plenty of scrutiny. His connections to organized crime and his aggressive tactics made him a lightning rod for controversy, setting the stage for the dramatic and complicated career that would follow. Power, politics, and the mob, rumors that wouldn't die. By the time 1957 rolled around, Jimmy Hawa had done what most union leaders could only dream of. He climbed all the way to the top and snagged the title of president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. And this wasn't just a fancy name on a business card. Hawa now led the most powerful labor union in the country, maybe even the world. With more than 2 million members, the Teamsters had muscle, money, and serious political pull. And Hawa was the man in charge of it all. Once he took the reins, Hawa wasn't exactly shy about solidifying his grip. He made moves like a chess master, appointing loyalists, tightening control over regional unions, and making sure anyone who stepped out of line knew he'd come down hard. He was relentless, hands-on, and always 2 steps ahead. Under Hawa's leadership, the Teamsters grew even more powerful, negotiating better contracts for workers, expanding benefits, and showing corporations that organized labor wasn't something to be pushed around. But with great power comes great suspicion, and for Hawa, the dark cloud hanging over his presidency was the ever-growing talk of his ties to the mafia. It wasn't just barroom gossip anymore. Reporters were writing about it, politicians were demanding investigations, and the feds, well, they were watching. The idea that Hawa was in bed with organized crime wasn't pulled out of thin air. There were whispers and sometimes full-on shouts that Hawa had worked with mobsters to secure loans, muscle out rival unions, and even run illegal businesses through Teamster channels. The union's Central States Pension Fund, a multi-million-dollar retirement stash for members, became a major focus. He insisted he was being targeted for fighting for the little guy. But let's just say the company he kept didn't do him any favors. Enter J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. Hoover, head of the FBI and a man with a flair for drama, had long downplayed the mafia's existence. But once he got wind of Hawa, something clicked. The Bureau launched intense surveillance, tapping phones, planting informants, and following Hawa everywhere. To Hoover, Hawa wasn't just a corrupt union boss. He was a symbol of everything that needed to be crushed to clean up American labor. Hawa, for his part, didn't exactly cower. He played the role of defiant outsider, the blue-collar leader standing up to the government elite. Of course, the real political fireworks came courtesy of the Kennedys. Robert F. Kennedy, then a young, ambitious Senate investigator and later Attorney General, practically made it his mission to take Hawa down. Their rivalry was legendary, TV-worthy stuff. Kennedy grilled Hawa in front of Senate committees, accused him of corruption, and labeled him public enemy #1 when it came to labor. Hawa responded with swagger and sarcasm, refusing to back down, even taunting Kennedy at hearings. The tension was thick. The drama was real. And just to make things even messier, there was Richard Nixon. In a strange political twist, Hawa actually supported Nixon over John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential race. He figured Nixon would go easier on labor unions, and especially on him. While it didn't help Nixon win that election, it planted the seeds for their future dealings. Years later, after Hawa was imprisoned, we'll get to that part soon, it was Nixon who would ultimately commute his sentence, though with a major catch. Hawa had to stay out of union politics. Spoiler alert, Hawa didn't like that deal one bit. The scandal that shook Hawa's empire, Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just the face of the Teamsters, he was the man holding the keys to one of the juiciest piggy banks in America, the Central States Pension Fund, meant to secure truckers' retirements. This fund had grown into a massive financial powerhouse, but under Hawa's watch, it became something else entirely, a bankroll for the mob's dreams. Let's back up. The Central States Pension Fund was built on worker contributions. Truckers were putting in their hard-earned money so they could retire without worry. Sounds pretty solid, right? But when Hawa saw how much money was sitting in that fund, he had other ideas. And the people who came knocking didn't exactly wear suits from Macy's. We're talking wise guys, real mafia figures with big plans and zero patience. What better way to fund new ventures, say, flashy casinos in Las Vegas, than through a legit pension fund? The mob needed capital, and Hawa had it. So massive loans started flowing out of the fund and into mafia-connected construction projects, hotels, and gambling joints out west. These weren't tiny loans either. Millions of dollars were getting funneled into Vegas and shady real estate deals, often with little or no paperwork. And shocker, a lot of that money never made its way back. In essence, the Central States Pension Fund became a silent partner in organized crime. The Teamsters Retirement Fund was bankrolling mobsters' high-rolling dreams, from the Strip in Vegas to developments in Florida and Chicago. And while the truckers, scraping through long hauls, thought their pensions were safe, much of their future was being gambled away, literally. The government caught on. In the early 60s, the FBI, already sniffing around Hawa for other shady dealings, began digging into the fund. By 1964, investigators were tracing story, and now after decades of dead ends and frustration, this could finally be the break that puts one of America's biggest mysteries to English. Auto-generated money trails leading straight to mafia frontmen and offshore accounts. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI started watching Hawa like a hawk, convinced he was the central hub in a web of corruption that tied labor, crime, and politics together. Now, Hawa never saw it that way. He claimed he was helping the union grow, building influence, and, sure, making smart investments. To his supporters, this was all part of how he built power for the working man. But to the government, it was a textbook case of corruption. The Central States Pension Fund scandal became a major piece of the puzzle that would eventually land Hawa behind bars. It wasn't just about money. It was about trust. The scandal showed just how deep Hawa's ties to the mob allegedly ran and how far he was willing to go to keep his empire strong. For some, he was a brilliant operator playing the game hard. For others, he was a crook in a suit. Hawa versus the system. The war with the law. By the mid-1960s, Jimmy Hawa wasn't just the face of the Teamsters. He was practically a household name. He'd clawed his way from grocery warehouse grunt to the top of one of the most powerful unions in the world. But with great power came intense scrutiny, and Hawa's high-profile swagger had made him a walking target for law enforcement. The feds wanted him behind bars, and in 1964 they finally got their shot. It all started unraveling when Hawa was convicted of jury tampering, mail fraud, and conspiracy. Basically, the government alleged that Hawa had tried to rig a previous trial by bribing jurors, never a good look when you're already under suspicion. To make things worse, the conviction wasn't a one-off. The feds were stacking charges, and Hawa was the bullseye in their anti-corruption crusade. The man who had once stared down corporate giants and mob bosses now found himself sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. Hawa didn't go down without a fight, of course. He appealed, he denied, he raged, but the legal machine had its grip on him, and in 1967 he officially traded in his tailored suits for prison blues. It was the fall of a labor titan, and for many, it looked like the end of the road. But this was Jimmy Hoffa we were talking about. Even behind bars, Hawa kept scheming. He remained obsessed with reclaiming his seat at the head of the Teamsters table. In prison, he reportedly maintained contact with union insiders, plotted his political return, and never stopped fighting. His mind never left the outside world, especially when it came to who was sitting in his old chair. Meanwhile, politics were shifting, and Hawa saw an opening. In 1969, Richard Nixon took office as president. Nixon wasn't exactly Hawa's best friend, but they shared one thing in common: mutual enemies. Nixon's administration was looking to shore up support from organized labor, and Hawa, even in prison, still had influence. Enter the deal of the decade. In 1971, Nixon commuted Hawa's sentence, meaning the Teamster boss got an early release from prison. Freedom, right? Not quite. The commutation came with a big catch. Hawa was prohibited from engaging in any union activity until 1980. That was nearly a full decade, an eternity in Hawa's eyes. Hawa didn't take that lying down. He immediately launched legal challenges to overturn the restriction. The government didn't budge, and Hawa kept maneuvering, trying to find legal loopholes or political allies who might help him get around the ban. He gave press conferences, rallied supporters, and painted himself as a victim of political persecution. His comeback tour had begun, even if the courts weren't ready to welcome him back. What's wild is that while Hawa was busy fighting for his political life, whispers about the mafia's growing discomfort with him began to spread. Some union officials were nervous too. Hawa's return, they feared, could stir up old alliances and rivalries, particularly those involving organized crime figures who'd gained a lot of influence in his absence. By the early 70s, Hawa's world had completely transformed. He was a free man, yes, but not free to be the man he used to be, and that gnawed at him. Still, Hawa was relentless. As we now know, it brought him one step too close to dangerous enemies.